Hello, my name is Scott Swartz, and I'm the postgraduate program lead for architecture at Oxford Brookes University in Oxford, United Kingdom. My presentation today is entitled Architectural Tupperware, Societal Changes Shown Through the Evolution of American Domestic Architecture. I'd like to begin by giving a bit of background on this topic, talking about the idea of architecture as a cultural container. When we study culture, it generally revolves around examining the products of that culture, what might be identified as the visible aspects, as depicted by the cultural iceberg by Dr. Brent Downs. However, as this image demonstrates, many aspects of the culture range from the less visible to being completely invisible. And architecture is one of the few cultural artifacts that embeds many of the less visible aspects into a visible form. So I would like to start off talking about the aspects of culture. Working from Maslow's hierarchy of needs, Dr. Joseph Juhas defines culture as embodying 5 broad aspects. Hopes. This includes the culture's aspirations, creative endeavors, and things like that. Fears, which generally revolve around the culture's concepts around safety and security. Needs, which are both the physiological needs as well as the psychological needs. Beliefs, including things like religion, science, philosophy, etc. And then the structures, both societal and hierarchical, that define how the culture is organized. I also want to talk about the intersection of art and architecture, because many people will view art as the primary cultural container of a society. However, I would rebut that with the quote by Adolf Loos, who was the progenitor of modernist architecture in the West. He stated in his manifesto, "The house has to please everyone, contrary to the work of art which does not. The work is a private matter for the artist, the house is not. The house has to serve culture, comfort. The work of art is revolutionary, the house is conservative. The work of art shows people new directions and thinks of the future, the house thinks of the present." I do want to note that I am not holding up Adolf Loos for any other reason than the fact that he founded modern architecture. He did have many reprehensible views, and in no way, shape, or form should his inclusion in this speech be considered to be approval of his other more difficult beliefs. But drawing off of this, I do want to point out that many people would, as I said, many people would view art as representative, but art is ornamental. Technology is functional. Architecture acts as both a social ornament and a utilitarian necessity, and therefore weds both halves of that aspect of culture. So when we look at archaeology and anthropology on societies where we lack written evidence of the group, or where we can't read the primary language, architectural remains are one of the primary objects for us to understand it. An example of this is the Minoan culture, where the writing, linear A, is not able to be deciphered. However, we have the architectural remains, such as the palace at Knossos, that tell us a great deal about their culture, about their religious beliefs, about their social structure, about the role of women in society, and many other things that we cannot determine through other means. So this frames the discussion that is to follow. So briefly, I want to talk about American architectural culture in general. As with most societies, American culture is embedded in our architecture. And this can even be seen in the words that we use to describe our buildings. We call the president's residence the White House, rather than the term that's common in Europe, the presidential palace. We can also even see the values of egalitarianism in the modest size of the White House. It's only 168 feet by 85 feet. And even after 2 centuries of additions and expansions, it's still only 55,000 square feet which makes it one of the smallest presidential residences and working offices in the world. Again, this is a representative of our egalitarian nature. We also see this in the legislative buildings in America and what they're depicting. As shown here, the state capitals from Rhode Island, North Carolina, and Colorado show the use of Greco-Roman architecture that resonates the idea of the Roman Republic and reflects on that in the modern era. Rather than drawing on Gothic architecture, as the Houses of Parliament in the UK have done, American architecture relies heavily on the Greco-Roman for their civic buildings, which again ties us back to the ideals of the Roman Republic and the Athenian democracy. But one of the best examples of the egalitarianism of American society is in the American residence. This was one of the first examples in the world where we see what we might term high-style architecture being democratized to the middle classes. Shown here is the Mordecai House in North Carolina, which was built in 1875. And in the Greco-Roman porticos and the proportions of it, you see echoes of buildings even as grand as the White House, replicated on a very modest scale for what was originally a modest farmhouse. This sort of middle-class architecture, reflecting the architecture of power, was something unique to America and forms the fundamental aspect of American residential architecture. So I want to look at our society and the evolution of the house in the past 150 years, roughly starting at the end of the American Civil War. Over the last century, the architecture has reflected massive cultural changes in the country. So this study examines how the middle-class house reflects society. For this study, I looked at middle-class houses that were, quote, mass-produced, whether they were produced through the use of pattern books, as in the Victorian era, or catalog houses, as we saw with the Sears Roebuck houses of the arts and crafts period, to the more modern tract home developments that exist after World War II. These houses are very good examples of the culture being embedded into the structure, because these are mass-produced, designed to be evocative for a large segment of society and to capture the aspirational nature of the American middle class. I've used these houses rather than architect-designed houses or self-built residences, because both of those tend to be much more highly customized for the occupant and therefore more reflective of personal values than of societal values. So we'll begin with the Victorian home, starting from about 1870 to a little bit after the turn of the century. The Victorian home was often some of the first suburban residences. This is the point at which large numbers of the American populace began to move from the countryside and farming, and also move out of the city core to build freestanding single-family residences in suburbs and suburban settings. So these houses tended to be very distinctive, very reflective of the culture. Some of the elements that we see here include things like the entry hall. In the Victorian period, it was very common to call on people, which was basically to knock on their door and have brief social chats. These formal entry halls were areas where these chats could happen without people being asked to be into more private parts of the house. This was very good, especially when you would send a servant to do the calling for arranging social events and other things. it allowed for that segmentation of the public realm to the private. We also see the parlor developing as a showcase for the family. These were showcases of the family's tastes, their travels, their collections of family heirlooms, and things like that. So the parlor functioned very much as an identity showcase for people in the Victorian time, because proprietary in the Victorian era was an essential aspect of the society. We have a series of highly formal rooms, including a formal dining room, a sitting room, and a parlor, which allowed for gender segregation of spaces. It was very common in the Victorian era for the men to retire after dinner to have conversation, leaving the women to have their own conversations. And the flow of the house, as seen here, with the different sitting rooms, dining rooms, and parlor, allows for that segregation to happen. The kitchen was a workspace generally dominated in middle-class homes by a live-in servant. And as you can see here, there's a back stair and a bedroom at the rear of the house to allow the servant to live in the house and to have a very discreet, separate life from the family. The back stair would allow her, and they were generally female servants, to do things like tend to the hearth at night so that the family could wake up to a hot breakfast. As we move on to the arts and crafts period, at the end of the Victorian era, there began a change in society. Calling ceased to be done in person and was replaced by the telephone and phone calling. So we see the house begin to change. Now in this period, the entryway is either drastically reduced in size or sometimes even eliminated entirely, as shown in this catalog home, where the main entry goes directly into the living room. The parlor is replaced by a single room called a living room, which reflects the birth of the radio and the phonograph, where the family would gather in a single space without gender segregation to listen to radio dramas or music, or sometimes even produce their own music on their own piano, as is shown again in the diagram to the right. Servant spaces disappear with the advent of modern appliances. As shown in this catalog ad below, you can see the modern gas stove, the indoor plumbing, the Hoosier cabinet, and other things which freed up the need for the servant to be a part of the household, which reduced and changed the pattern of life in the house. As we move on to the post-war era, we see an increase in the middle class spurred by a massive upswing in new houses. After the end of World War II, many returning soldiers would go to college on the GI Bill and would gain degrees and work in business at a level previously unseen in America. Others would take up trades, working in union factories, also earning a good wage, which suddenly allowed the working class and the clerks and others to have the aspiration to enter into a full middle class house. Formality in these houses further disappeared with the advent of the television. So you see the living room now becoming the center of the TV world. Eventually, as we move through the 50s and later, the hearth or fireplace being replaced in its entirety by the digital hearth of the television set. The dining room still remains a formal space, but it becomes more integrated into the kitchen, because the kitchen now has become a showplace for the technology of the gas or the electric range, the dishwasher, the washing machine, and other modern conveniences. So it was very important for people to be able to see the kitchen, which started to change the kitchen from being simply a place of work to being a positional good to show your place in society. Multiple bathrooms also appear in this period, again, because the commonality of indoor plumbing now was rolled out to pretty much all classes, and it became very important to show that you had the ability to have multiple bathrooms. However, there is also a contrasting frugality. Many of the people living in these houses came of age or were children during the 30s and 40s, during the Great Depression and the war rationing. And this frugality carried into the home, with much smaller houses becoming the norm in this period. Moving on, we hit what I would call peak subdivision, when the tract home became the form of the house. Industrial type processes were introduced in this period and became full blown in this period, where subdivisions would be built with 5 or 6 different house plans, and the builder could maximize the efficiency because they were repeating the same few patterns over and over and over. In this period, we see an era when the teenager starts to come of age, and privacy for teenagers became something that was very important. So we see multiple bedrooms so each child could have their own private space. We also see at this point, again, a return to multiple living spaces where you have a formal living room and dining room, which would allow you to do the entertaining necessary to maintain your social position, while allowing for a family room that was a much more informal living space, and a breakfast room, which was where the family would normally take their meals unless they were entertaining. Moving on to the current trends, we see again a massive shift as gender roles in the house have begun to break down, and cooking, for example, has become much more of a family event. We see the open concept becoming the standard form, with very few formal spaces in the house. This allows for the family to interact at all points in the evening, where they're cooking and watching television and sharing time together. And there is much less formality, with often only a formal dining room or maybe a formal living room as a remnant of the previous formal spaces. However, with the advent of working at home and boundaryless work, home offices have now become absolutely mandatory in the middle class home, where you have a space for for one or both parents to work in private. We also see master bedrooms being separated and distant from the other bedrooms, again allowing for more privacy for the inhabitants. So as you can see in this brief study, you can chart many of the sociological developments in America as they affect our homes today. Thank you very much for participating. And if you have any questions, I believe there will be a question period after this presentation.